John, one of the 12 apostles of Christ. He is often referred to as the apostle of love because of his capacity in the scriptures to love and be loved by the Lord Jesus. What can we learn from the apostle John about showing a genuine love for God? In a letter to all believers many years after the death of Jesus Christ, he writes these words, "For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments." Is it really possible for us to show genuine love for God while we intentionally disobey His commandments? When questioned by a lawyer regarding the greatest commandment, Jesus said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment." There are many within popular Christianity today who say that grace makes void the law of God, and thus allows us to say with our lips that we love God, but express by our actions the very opposite. The new covenant between God and man was centered upon the same perfect, uncompromising law of God as the old covenant. However, under the new covenant, God did not write His law on tablets of stone, but upon the hearts and minds of His people. There was no change in the law of the covenant, for the law of God is eternal and does not change. Rather, the new covenant was established upon new and better promises. The old covenant was based upon the promises of the people, whereas the new covenant was based upon the promises of God. That is, the promise of God to save His people from their transgression of His law through the atoning sacrifice of His Son. So this new covenant, or promise, is governed by the very same law of God. Love, many say, is the law that Jesus commands us to follow now, not the law. But how is it possible to express love toward God while disregarding His law? Who is able, without love, to regard even one of the 10 Commandments? What greater expression of love exists than the expression of one's obedience and submission to the will of God? And what greater expression of the will of God than the law of the 10 Commandments, which was manifested and exalted by His Son, Jesus Christ? How can we claim to love God and each other without regarding God's law? The law, as a pure expression of God's eternal nature, can no more be abolished than the very nature of God Himself. Instead, the perfect nature and law of God was manifested and exalted in the person of Jesus Christ. The attempt to make void God's law is not only error, but a form of apostasy that will take greater shape within the church as we draw nearer to Christ's return. A false concept of grace by a lukewarm church during the days just before Christ's return will condone and excuse lawlessness, causing many churches to become indistinguishable from the world. By Satan's clever design, the eternal law of God will be stripped from the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Why? Because Satan's ultimate objective has always been to overthrow the government of God, and the target of his assault has always been the law of God. Consider this. But for God's eternal and unchanging law, what is there that condemns us? If there is no law to condemn us, what need is there of God's grace? Is it not the perfect and unyielding law of God that demands our lives as punishment? Was it not this lawful demand that was satisfied by the sacrificial death of God's own Son? And is it not the law of God that convicts us of our daily sin and leads us back to God's forgiveness and abundant grace? The life and death of Jesus Christ bears witness to the uncompromising nature of God's law. His death at Calvary is the strongest evidence for it. If the law of God was capable of change, would not the death of Christ have been avoidable? God could have simply repealed or amended his selfsame law to spare us who stand condemned by it. Why do we have such an immediate and rebellious aversion to the mention of God's law? And why do we preach in the house of God that his eternal law has been abolished? From where does this spirit of rebellion come? The answer is, it comes from our natural-born enmity toward God and his eternal government. God's plan to save mankind from that natural hostility toward their Creator was established from the foundation of the world. God said to the serpent when punishing him, "I will put enmity between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." God said this to the serpent because when sin entered the heart of man, enmity against his Creator also entered. Our sinful heart became perfectly aligned with the serpent's. Our hostility was against God and his eternal government. But God, prophesying his plan of redemption and reconciliation for man, tells the serpent that by a future sacrifice, the enmity of sin between God and man will one day be removed and put between the serpent and man. To this end, Jesus has done nothing to abolish the law of his Father, and everything to establish and magnify it. God said this about his Son, Jesus Christ, through the prophet Isaiah. "The Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable."